Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Will Bosnan and I work in the school attendance policy team here at the department. This is the third in a series of school attendance practice sharing webinars that we're running this term. And I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by Sue Morris-King, who's a senior HMI for Ofsted. Sue is going to be talking about the key findings from a recent report compiled by Ofsted, looking at how schools are securing high levels of attendance and tackling persistent absence. As everyone on this call is aware, ensuring that children obviously regularly attend school is a top priority for the department, and clearly an ambition that we share with everybody on this call and indeed with schools across the country. The Secretary of State in particular has made clear that really understanding, getting to grips with and supporting schools to address persistent absence is a top priority for the department. And importantly, it's a prerequisite, I think, for everything else that we and you are trying to achieve in schools. So that's really the context, in fact, in which this report from Sue has been produced. And I think the report itself is really helpful in distilling some of the key themes and strategies which leaders have told us have been effective at reducing absence and persistent absence. So we've got the link, I think, to the report in the sidebar. If you've not already read it, it should be on the right-hand side of your screen, the link to that report. And there are a couple of things actually that I wanted to cover just briefly by way of introduction before we kind of kick off and look at the key findings from that report. Firstly, there will be a kind of short 10-minute question and answer session at the end of this presentation. So please submit any questions via the question tab that you should be able to see on the right hand side of your screen. And I'll be putting a few of the most relevant questions actually to Sue at the end of this session. Just to be clear, we'll only be taking questions on the subject of this report and the findings in the report. So please, can you keep your questions confined to those areas, please? Secondly, we've got a number of further attendance best practice sharing webinars planned for the rest of this term. We've got another secondary school, in fact, St Thomas More, that we'll be talking about their approach on Thursday. And we have another webinar after half term. So if you're interested in signing up to those events, you'll find the links to register also at the side of the screen. Thirdly, we'll be recording this webinar and we've set up a page on .gov.uk for people to access the recordings. So if there are any that you've missed so far this term, or you want to catch up or share the videos with other people, then please visit that link and share as appropriate. And finally, last kind of element of housekeeping, we're keen to gather feedback about this series, find out whether people find these webinars helpful and what they might want covered as part of future sessions. So at the end of the presentation, we'd be really grateful if you could provide some feedback, again in a link that should be on the right hand side of the screen. Before I pass over to Sue, who's going to talk through the findings of the report, I also wanted to kind of briefly set out a few of the actions that we're actually taking in the department in conjunction with you to support stronger attendance. And I think lots of you on the call will be familiar with these already, but I thought it'd be kind of helpful actually just to go through a few of them at the beginning of this presentation. As I'm sure many of you will be aware, we're currently consulting on changes to the school attendance system as a whole, and the proposals in the consultation are really focused on setting clear expectations about the roles of schools, local authorities and MATs. And we've actually got proposals in the consultation about formalising the requirement for all schools to have an attendance policy. And we're also looking at broader changes to the attendance legal framework. So please take a look at that consultation, have a look at the associated documents, and if you're interested in feeding into those proposals, please do so by responding to that consultation. Ultimately, the kind of intention of the consultation is to improve the quality and consistency of support that we're providing for attendance across the country. So have a look at that if you are interested in the consultation. I also wanted to mention the work of the Attendance Action Alliance. So that's a group of key stakeholders from across the education system that the department has convened. And that's a group actually that's chaired by the Secretary of State. And they're really thinking about some of the kind of broader causes of absence and persistent absence, and how those can be addressed. And this is, I think, really recognising some of those wider barriers to excellent attendance. So the individuals in the Alliance have made various pledges in their respective fields to take forward different pieces of work to try and support stronger attendance and reduce absence and persistent absence. So we're looking at how, for instance, social care, social workers, GPs, charities, the police and others can play their part in supporting you to improve attendance. So that's one thing with the work of the Attendance Action Alliance. As everyone else has joined this call is hopefully aware, we're obviously running this series of good practice sharing events. We've got a series with focused on school and trust level practice, but we're also running an equivalent series of events with local authorities looking at local authority practice as well. So that's another thing that we're currently rolling out. And as I mentioned actually in the last of these sessions, we're also in the process of beginning a live attendance data pilot project. And the intention of that project really is to improve the flow of data between schools, between local authorities, between MATs and the department ultimately. Clearly, a lot of the important work that you do in school and a lot of the important work that happens at a local authority level is informed by really high quality data. So I'd really encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to sign up to that pilot when you receive the notification. And we're actually looking to share some of that data back with the sector once the kind of pilot is up and running. And in the longer term, we're thinking about how that data pilot can actually reduce some of the burdens associated with the manual attendance data collections that we currently run. So final item on the list that I wanted just to bring to people's attention that have joined this call, we're currently also piloting some work with a small number of attendance advisors, and they are in the process actually of working with a number of MATs and local authorities across the country, supporting them to kind of review their current approaches to attendance, audit their practice and think about ways in which they can improve. So that's everything that I had to say by way of introduction. Thank you very much for bearing with me. And I'll now pass over to Sue Morris-King, who's very kindly agreed to talk through the findings from her report. Sue.
Thank you, Will. Good to be here this afternoon, and thanks everybody for listening in. As Will's just said, I'm going to talk through the findings from the report. So if I could have the first slide, thank you. As Will has just mentioned, the next slide, thank you. As Will's just mentioned, this was a briefing that was requested by the Secretary of State. And it was a quick turnaround piece. So we did this really in a couple of weeks, looking into all sorts of different evidence, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. And the focus was very much on teasing out some of that really good practice that exists in schools about promoting attendance and minimising persistent absence. So it was looking to see what schools do when they do this really well. It has got some COVID related focus. It's mainly more general because that was what was wanted from this report. So what I'll do now is take you through some of those key findings, and as Will's just said, there'll be a chance to ask some questions at the end. So if I could have the next slide. So this is what we did to actually produce this report. So it consists of a number of different facets. So inspection evidence from schools. Now, we didn't just look at schools in general. We all know that it is particularly tough to tackle attendance and absence in schools with high deprivation. So we took some data on this, schools with high deprivation and with low persistent absence rates over time. So those schools that have managed to maintain that. And we looked at those that we'd inspected under the EIF, and we judged to be good or outstanding. So there was quite a lot there in terms of what we had in terms of inspection evidence that we could look at to tease out some of these really key factors. We had some focus groups and some discussions with primary and secondary leaders. And if any of those people who took part in that and helped us out with that are listening in this afternoon, then a huge thank you to you, because we couldn't have put this together without the voice and the experiences of primary and secondary leaders. If you get the chance to read the report, you will see that throughout there are woven primary and secondary leaders' perspectives and thoughts and views and some quotes. We looked as well at inspection evidence from schools that we judged to be inadequate in the autumn term, and that was to tease out any factors that were worth highlighting when things weren't going as well, although that isn't the key focus of the report. We held a number of focus groups with HMI because from doing that we could see what they were seeing in schools, and we could reflect back then some of the experiences that schools themselves were having, particularly around COVID, and that was another source of our evidence. And finally, we surveyed our HMI colleagues about challenges that they'd seen, i.e. the challenges that you in schools are facing during the autumn term. And what we can see is that some of those challenges are really going into this term as well. Next slide, thank you. So we've just published the report last week. You might have had the chance to read it. You probably haven't because it's pretty soon. It's only short, I think it's 13 or 14 pages. And three main sections, as I said, challenges in autumn 2021, and they were mainly around COVID related challenges. And then the main part of the report talks about what schools have done over time to secure good attendance and how they've tackled persistent absence. What we found when we were looking at the evidence and when we were talking to and listening to leaders was that if we distilled all of this, schools that get this right, we could say they listen, i.e. they listen to pupils, they listen to parents. They understand what lies beneath the issues that arise. They empathise and they support. But what we heard time and time again, and what we saw through our inspection evidence throughout, was that isn't where it stops, the empathising, the supporting, the listening, understanding. It was about a really quite a tough message about finding ways around the barriers and not tolerating situations that led to low absence, really, really carefully unpicking those to see what needed to happen next. And what we found throughout, and what we've said actually in the introduction to the report, is that schools don't take the same approach. We heard different things from different schools in different circumstances, primary, secondary, special, AP. But this underlying summary, this listen, understand, empathise, support, but do not tolerate, came through from various different types of schools and different leaders. And that was what they had in common. And I think the other thing that it's worth highlighting that these schools had in common when we listened, and what we saw in our inspection evidence, was a message from leaders about this never being job done. It was about securing good attendance for pupils as being something that was seen as an ongoing process, never being actually something that is finished, because it always needs attention in some way, shape or form. Next slide, thank you. So unsurprisingly, we saw, and we still see, schools continuing to face challenges in tackling absence that is indirectly related to the pandemic. But again, what we saw overall was that schools that usually tackle absence well, they're carrying on doing so. We heard a lot from leaders about anxiety, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a short while, but pupils' anxiety, parents' anxiety are writ large at the moment. It's very clear in our inspections that it will be something, no doubt, that you're coming across quite a lot in schools. But we also heard about some of the newer challenges, again, that I'll touch upon in a minute, that have come perhaps in the last few months. But this message about leaders carrying on using their same strategies, we see a lot about leaders using the same strategies they usually do, but also adapting and saying, okay, so if this isn't working now in this current context, what else do we need to do? What do we need to do differently in terms of removing barriers to pupils' attendance? And we've seen many, many examples of schools acting systematically just to do exactly that, to remove those barriers. Next slide, thank you. So I'm going to take us into some of the detail now. And starting with where the report starts, which are the challenges that we saw in autumn 2021. And as I've just said, we know continue quite a lot of these to come into this current term as well. So pupils' anxieties and parents' anxieties were a major reason for absence in autumn 2021, and they continued into the autumn term. And when we come to unpick that, what we hear is from schools and what we see through our inspection evidence is that this isn't always directly related to school, but it's about some of those experiences that those children and young people have had since the pandemic began. So, for example, sources of anxiety for pupils of all different ages are things like worrying about family members being ill, pupils concerned that that might happen, what might happen if they come into school, if they catch COVID when they're there. There's the aspect of pupils having seen their parents under more stress than usual over the whole of the COVID pandemic, experiencing domestic violence, experiencing financial hardship, for example. We've also heard from Year 11 pupils about how they're worried about their exams that might be cancelled. Will they be cancelled? Will they be happening this time? What impact might that have on their future? Some pupils worrying about not being able to come to school. Will there be another lockdown? We heard from secondary school leaders in particular how pupils being at home and being online more had sometimes led to more social media related anxiety from the interactions that children and young people were having. So although we know that some of these aren't related directly to school, they have been having an impact on attendance for some pupils. We've heard a lot about media-fueled anxiety, how sometimes what's in the press can make pupils more anxious. Anti-vaxxer protests, for example, outside schools, and some heads telling us how absolutely understandably that have made their pupils very, very concerned. And sometimes media talking about spikes in COVID cases in a local area has had a knock-on effect directly to attendance in schools in that area, because parents being anxious, keeping their children off school. We've heard about some of the newer challenges. So on the slide where we've put continued bubble mentality, what that was about, we've heard from a lot of schools about this actually, is that having leaders having schooled parents really carefully and sensitively in what working in a bubble meant. Actually, some families are finding it quite hard to move away from that. So, for example, thinking that they need to keep their children at home because they've heard another child in the class has got COVID. And an interesting one that came to light that a number of schools are finding quite tricky is this perception of education in school versus at home. Obviously, throughout the pandemic, school leaders, you've worked really hard at almost selling the value of remote education to children and to pupils. So pupils really have worked hard with you to do their remote education at home. And you've told them about how important that was and how valuable that is. And so what sometimes heads have been saying to us is that now they're hearing from pupils, well, if education at home is okay, and you said it was, you said it was valuable, you said it was good, actually I preferred it, so why can't I carry on doing that? And so it's quite a tricky one for leaders to be unpicking with pupils about the value of now being back in school. We've heard, in terms of removing barriers, that what schools are doing when they're doing this well is really systematically analysing those reasons for absence. So not dismissing that anxiety, but really getting underneath what sits beneath it, and then sensitively but firmly challenging that with pupils and with parents, so that pupils do feel able to come into school. We've heard quite a lot when we were doing this survey about some adaptive PSHE content. So where leaders know that there is something in particular that is bothering their pupils, for example, the value of vaccination, they've actually unpicked that and taught some of that in the PSHE, and we've heard a lot about some of the PSHE curriculum being adapted to have that focus on mental health and well-being as well. And then the final point on that slide is doing what we always do. When we were talking to leaders, when we were listening to leaders, and when we've heard from them on inspections, this idea that actually that analysis, that day-to-day challenge, that relationships with families, relationships with pupils is a heightened version of what you always do when you do it well. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of securing good attendance in general, when we've analysed this aspect, it's come down to a number of different factors, but in the report, some of the strongest ones that we've highlighted are the ones that are on the screen and a few others that I'll talk about in a moment. So the one that was writ large in every conversation we had, in the inspection evidence and in talking to inspectors, to HMI, is this one about communicating expectations to parents. The importance of that can't be underestimated. And what we've heard from school leaders is that first and foremost, that's about relationships, because actually a lot of this is about communicating those expectations in that really honest way and giving some really tough messages. But they, of course, need to be built on those firm foundations of that positive relationship in the first place. And leaders in particular who've actually really brought attendance up from a very low baseline were very clear about how they had to build that positive relationship first in order to then be able to give those tough, unequivocal messages. Exemplifying what attendance looks like when it's good is also something that's really important and came through everything that we heard and saw in inspections. And that's about the fact that actually, for example, 75% attendance in a test might be pretty good, but actually 75% in a test might be really good, but 75% attendance is not what you want. And so leaders talk to us a lot about the importance of exemplifying what good attendance looks like, and also explaining what the impact of that is if pupils aren't attending well. So, for example, if you're missing 10% of school or 20% of school, that's X number of phonics lessons or X number of GCSE science lessons. Tenacity, we heard a lot about the importance of sticking with these messages and that consistency, because where there are those really quite intransigent issues around attendance, they don't go away overnight. But what we did hear was that eventually schools got to a point when they were unpicking this, where there was a culture change, where parents understood where they wanted their children to be in. They wanted to be getting the positive letters, the positive praise about attendance, the good conversations, rather than that feeling of constant challenge. The second one about communicating expectations to pupils. As a number of leaders said to us, actually, if you only talk to parents, then it doesn't really do the job, because pupils, especially older ones, can vote with their feet. And it's important that pupils know why they need to be in school and for how much. We heard a lot from leaders about the importance of their own positive presence. That making pupils feel as if they want them to be in school. The start to the day, the greeting the pupils when they arrive, so that that's something that they look forward to, that is positive, whatever their start to the day might have been like at home, and giving them those reasons to attend. And then the third one is about that analysis. There are many reasons, as everybody listening will know, why pupils don't attend school. And in the report, we've talked about a whole host of those. They are many and varied, and they're not the same from one pupil to the next. Sometimes they're straightforward and simple, sometimes they're actually highly complicated. And so that getting underneath what that problem is was seen to be really crucial in terms of tackling attendance, really listening to parents about those reasons why, and then tackling the simple stuff first as leaders often referred to it. Actually, if it is, for example, about not being able to get to school on time, leaders talked about some of the really straightforward things that they could do with families to support them to get their children to school on time. In terms of having the right people in place, what we could see across all the evidence was this really careful thinking from leaders about who it is who is best placed to give those messages, especially when there's some of those tough messages. Some leaders talked to us about actually some training to have what they called courageous conversations. Staff don't necessarily have those skills to have those conversations with parents about attendance and getting underneath that. For example, if you're talking about a form tutor. And so leaders told us about the importance of working with their staff and giving them that support, training and guidance. And also they talked to us about, and again we heard this on inspection and hear it a lot, it isn't always the head who is the right person to have that conversation. Sometimes that's intimidating to a parent. And having those different people with those different skills is a really important aspect of getting that message across to parents, getting underneath the issue and giving them that support. But also where things get more tricky, that constant point of contact can be really powerful. And having people with varied skills as well. Leaders mentioned to us variously, for example, having employed former police officers, former people who've worked in the probation service, social workers, who have got different skills that they can bring to this quite tricky conversation that sometimes has to be had about attendance. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of noticing patterns, so everybody records attendance, all schools record attendance, but when schools have really done a good job on this and have really got underneath attendance, what we see is really careful, systematic analysis, getting underneath what that data says, so that, as for example, leaders said to us, you realise suddenly that that pupil has missed the past 4 Mondays. And if it is the past 4 Mondays, why is that? Is this because there is something at the weekend that becomes a barrier to attendance on Monday? Once you've got the patterns, or you think you've got the patterns, you can begin to ask some of those questions that enable you then to put those actions in place to move this forwards. And I think what we found was it's particularly important in secondary schools where actually pupils spend time with lots of different members of staff, and it is arguably more difficult to spot those patterns, and it is easier to miss some of those possible issues that underlie them. But actually it's important in any setting that's a degree of formality in that analysis so that those questions can be asked. What one leader said to us, for example, was the key is acting swiftly when things start to slide, because it is so much easier, isn't it, to pick it up at that point and put some action in place than to have to be unpicking some really intransigent, deep-seated issues around attendance. When we unpicked all the factors as well that related to good attendance and to low absence, particularly persistent absence, we heard a lot about this not being just about attendance, and actually this being about ambition, this being about everybody's business all the time. A number of leaders, when we started to unpick this, talked to us about in their school seeing attendance a little bit like they see safeguarding. In other words, something that is threaded through all the business of the school, and it isn't just the business of one person, and they saw it as being aligned in terms of importance. It's also about the curriculum, and again, time and time again, we see those links between the right curriculum, the good positive diet of the right curriculum, the right teaching that pupils get in school, and the links to them wanting to be there. ethos, the right ethos, where pupils are safe, where they feel that they're not being bullied, where they feel that they can come to school every day, feel safe, be safe. Celebrating success was talked about a lot, and that wasn't just in terms of celebrating success in terms of attendance, but in terms of success in general, in terms of learning. And then that final bit, more than just being present in school, this is quite a subtle one, but we could see through a lot of the evidence this idea that in the schools that tackled attendance really well and got attendance right, this was also about making sure that all pupils were present, for example, in clubs, in enrichment activities, that SEND pupils were equally included, that this wasn't a generic, this is for everybody, but there was some real drilling down into who was included in what. In terms of governors, that's an important aspect. Sometimes what we see is that governing bodies will ask leaders for attendance. That's very common. But sometimes they just ask for the overall attendance figure. And of course, the overall attendance figure doesn't give us any of that nuance. It doesn't tell us what lies beneath. It doesn't tell us what those patterns are, or whether there are any particular groups of pupils who were just not attending properly over time. And again, where governors actually really were quite powerful in moving attendance forward. This was also about them conveying these shared expectations. And if there'd been a culture of low expectations of attendance historically in the school, governors can be really powerful in actually unpicking some of that and helping the school leaders to challenge parents. And there is a short section in the report about some of the weaknesses that we saw in some schools' practice. I said that we analysed some of the evidence around schools where overall they've been judged to be inadequate. Now, we know that there are schools that are judged to be inadequate where attendance is still actually really positive and the ethos is positive and children want to come to school. But in some of those schools we saw where attendance wasn't positive, it wasn't good. And in those situations, what we saw sometimes was some inaccurate recording of attendance, a lack of the analysis that I've talked about earlier to get underneath things, a lack of strategic oversight, a lack of urgency sometimes, for example, waiting too long before challenging absence. And then actually, and we say this in the report, we also saw sometimes situations where there were a lot of people working really hard to improve attendance, but they weren't working together. So lots of people in the school working in isolation. And because the strategies weren't joined up, they weren't having that desired effect. Next slide, thank you. What we saw in terms of tackling persistent absence was that having all those basics in place, all those things I've just talked about, were really, really key. Because if those aren't in place, then actually persistent absence is arguably more likely to be prevalent. However, what I think we all know is you can have all of those good things in place and you will still have some pupils whose needs are really complex and who have really quite intransigent, persistent absence. And so actually where that happens and where that is, where those pupils and families are supported really well, we saw another whole layer, another whole level of looking at barriers, being really analytical to try to break down what those barriers were. One of the things that we saw and we heard about a lot was the power of sharing information across primary and secondary schools, because where absence is really deep-seated and intransigent, quite often that is about something that goes across a whole family and not just with individual pupils in a primary school or in a secondary school. So we've seen a lot where primary and secondary schools have shared some of that information and then looked at this across the whole piece, across the family, and that's been really quite powerful. And then we've also seen some really impressive examples in many situations of schools really working carefully with that individual with a different response depending on the barriers. And part of that is recognising those really small improvements, because quite often those pupils don't fit in, do they, to those reward schemes and those day-to-day recognitions that you might have in place, because they may be getting their attendance up from 40% to 45%. But schools that do this well are really very, very careful to recognise those small improvements. There's also that bit about welcome and catch up on return. If you're the pupil who has been out for many, many days, weeks, months, and you've missed a whole lot of work, then actually being welcomed back into the classroom and feeling that there is some kind of sense or hope of catch up, and knowing how the school is going to help you to do that in some way is really important. And finally, and of course it absolutely needs to be said, where there's intransigent, deep-seated, persistent absence, this is not something very often that the school can tackle by themselves. So that multi-agency working, when we're talking about persistent absence, came out loud and clear from everything that school leaders said to us and all of our inspection evidence. So, Will, that's the end of my presentation, and thank you everybody for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions if we have any that need to be answered.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks very much for such a clear and methodical taking us through the kind of key findings from that report. I think that was really, really helpful. One of the things, I mean, I think it's things to some extent that you've covered already in the presentation and that are covered in more detail in the report, but I wondered if you could say, we've had a question come through about pupil anxiety and whether anything came up about the kind of particularly effective strategies that schools had found for addressing pupil anxiety. You mentioned that really it's about getting under the skin of what underlies that absence in that case, the anxiety of that pupil, and I suppose it's about tailoring the support that you put in place as a result of that. But was there more to say about the conversations that you had with schools about that anxiety point?
Sure, and I think there is more about it in the report, and I think that in a way the headline there is that aspect of listening to pupils and listening to parents, because I think it's clear from everything we all know about attendance and absence that anxiety, people's anxieties, families' anxieties per se, this is not new, but it is heightened and deeply heightened by COVID. So, for example, we heard from one school that actually parents sometimes were too anxious to bring their children onto the playground, and sometimes that was about social media driven anxiety. So maybe parents have fallen out with each other on social media, and then the parent themselves in a primary school didn't want to bring their children onto the playground. Now, when we tested that out a little bit more, because I hadn't really heard much about that aspect before, we found that that was actually fairly common in terms of primary schools' experiences. And schools were talking about the things they'd done, for example, allowing the parent to bring the child in a bit early or a bit late so that they didn't have to be with the other parents. In terms of pupils' anxieties, we heard all sorts of things, everything from where it was fairly widespread general anxiety, for example, the one about vaccination. And we heard from a secondary school that they'd really looked at putting a module into their PSHE curriculum that was about vaccinations and how vaccination over time had worked and what was the point of it, and to lower some of those anxiety levels, and that had been really effective. But then we heard about some very individualised strategies, such as, I remember one that was a pupil who was really, really worried about coming into school. And this had been heightened through COVID. And the school had a school dog, and the pupil was allowed to walk the school dog for a little while before they came into school. And that, for that particular pupil, that worked, and it made their anxiety lessen, and they were able to come in through the front door to the school. So everything from some of the curriculum related aspects all the way through to some really individualised strategies that we heard about.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
We've had another question as well about, again, thinking about the report and the conversations that you've had. Is there more to say about the kind of role of governors and the way in which governors can effectively challenge leaders to improve attendance and hold leaders to account for rates of attendance within schools and trusts?
Absolutely, yeah, a good question. I think the key is the one that I mentioned there, which is for governors to get a realistic picture of attendance. And so I would say an absolute key there is for governors to ask leaders to provide them with more than that, just that big picture figure. Or if that's what's being provided in a governor's meeting, ask some really good questions about what does that look like for different groups of pupils? What's attendance like, for example, with pupils with special educational needs and disabilities? How does this compare with what you would expect it to be given the COVID factors at the moment? And then ask leaders about whether there are any particular barriers to improving attendance for different groups or for individuals, because sometimes here governors can support. A good example here is, I would say, holidays in term time. And we hear quite often where that's been an issue for a school community. Sometimes it's taken governors' intervention or support of the head teacher to really sort of put down that marker to say, actually, this isn't okay. And maybe it has been in the past, but this is not what we're going to authorise, and to help explain to families the reasons why that isn't okay. We also heard things like local patterns of absence. Governors can be really powerful there. For example, we heard about, for example, pupils always taking time off to do some seasonal work, whether that is farm related or jobs to do with the seaside economy. And governors, particularly when they're members of the community, can be quite powerful in supporting some of those messages from schools about stopping that from happening. So I would say ask those sharp questions and support leaders to just be appropriately challenging.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions, if that's okay. So I've had one here, which is about the implications of this report for children with special educational needs and also for alternative provision settings. Do you care to elaborate on those 2 points, please?
Absolutely, and I would say that all of this in here is really pertinent for both those settings, and those settings, you know, alternative provision in particular, but special schools as well, have obviously had to work really, really hard, always do have to work really hard to get good attendance. So all of these messages around the analysis, around the current barriers, around the communication of expectations are very relevant and very pertinent. And I think in terms of SEND in mainstream schools, one of the things that we do say in the report is that actually when mainstream schools get this right, they focus on pupils with special educational needs and what the school is like for them. What is the ethos like? Is it a place that those pupils feel safe and comfortable to be? Are they bullied? Are they supported? And if there are issues, are those properly tackled? So although I haven't particularly mentioned SEND today, all of this is relevant. And I think if you read that if you read the report as a school leader from a special school or an AP, you will see that some of those aspects are very relevant in your settings. The multi-agency part, this report doesn't go into in any great depth. As we said earlier, it was a quick turnaround piece. Multi-agency working is often particularly important, isn't it, in a specialist setting? And it's something that we know that when specialist settings do this well, you do it very well indeed. And multi-agency working becomes even more important.
Excellent, thank you. And final question, which wasn't touched on in the presentation, but I'd be interested to hear if this came up in any of the conversations, which is, there's a question here about the use of statutory action, legal intervention, when all else fails, and what, if anything, that the schools that you spoke to had to say about the use of such action, and I guess working with the local authority to do that.
Interestingly, it wasn't particularly something that featured in our conversations. And actually neither did rewards. Actually, a few people mentioned that they used rewards, but what we've pulled out here are some of the most prevalent aspects of what schools mentioned. However, I think it is fair to say that we do hear from schools that is an important part of their armoury, as it were. When they need to use those statutory interventions, they do so.
Excellent. Sorry. Thank you very much, Sue.